Steve, I, like most, have wondered about the afterlife, not just in a personal sense, but as indicative of what reality is all about. Now, lots of people have arguments, certainly theologians do, and analytical philosophers, in dismissing the impossibility of it. You come at it very differently. You look for evidence. Is this realistic?
I don't know whether it's realistic. It certainly becomes more urgent as I become more chronologically challenged. Yeah, I think it's realistic because there are a number of compelling, at least suggestive types of evidence, whether it's evidence suggesting reincarnation, whether it's evidence from mental mediumship, people who apparently provide communications from deceased friends and relatives. There's also some intriguing new evidence from heart-lung transplant cases where heart-lung recipients take on personality characteristics of the donors of whom they knew nothing.
There's a part of me that wants to reject everything that you said immediately.
Well,
am I a stereotypical conditioned by the science of this world, or what's wrong with me?
Well, there are probably too many things to go into, but it's understandable why many people would want to reject that, at least initially. And what I like to do personally is to look at other sorts of exotic possible counter-explanations. As far as I'm concerned, we have a certain range of options when looking at the evidence suggesting life after death.
Well, let's look at the evidence first. What is the evidence in some of these cases? You've investigated them, right?
Well, there are cases where young children apparently know or act as if they are reincarnated people who lived at a considerable distance and a considerable separation in time from these children and their family. There are very intriguing cases of mediumistic communication where mediums provide very personal bits of information allegedly transmitted by the deceased through them that is later verified by investigators and which nobody knew about normally.
Isn't that the normal stuff we see on daytime television, is it?
No, not at all. The cases are much more interesting than that, and to appreciate that, there's no substitute for actually looking at the evidence.
And you've done this?
Yes.
Extensively?
Yes.
Okay, so you believe that at least in some of these cases, there's enough evidence to make you investigate further?
Yes, I think there's enough to make the investigation a legitimate activity, and it's been carried out systematically and very carefully by a number of people. Now, for me, there are a number of intriguing explanatory options, some more so than others. I would say that when we're looking at this apparent body of evidence, we can first of all deal with what I would call the usual suspects. These would be fraud, misperception, malobservation, hidden memories. The reason some cases are so good is that the usual suspects can't even gain a foothold. It's very easy to rule out malobservation, misreporting, et cetera, et cetera. Then we have what I would call the unusual suspects. These would be appeals to unusual or abnormal processes like dissociation, as in multiple personality and hypnosis, along with the release of various kinds of latent abilities, which perhaps only emerge in various altered states of consciousness. We might also have to deal with cases similar to those found in prodigies or savants, where people display various kinds of abilities without the usual kinds of prerequisites. And in the case of savants, sometimes abilities that are radically discontinuous with their ordinary capacities. So we have calculating savants who can factor any number presented to them, but who can't add the change in their pocket.
Everything you just said was a non-survival explanation of the data.
Right.
What next?
Well, there's one more non-survivalist option. It's more exotic than most people want to consider, but since we're just considering the abstract alternatives, I think we have to consider this as well. These would be what I would call super psi explanations. That is, the evidence suggesting survival of bodily death would be explained in terms of psychic functioning among the living that simply simulates evidence for survival of bodily death.
So these people who have these incredible amount of knowledge that seems to prove survival in some way are really getting that information not from a survival mechanism, but rather through psychic phenomena, paranormal phenomena of the present time.
Right. Think of it this way. Suppose a medium says to me, your Uncle Harry is communicating with me now. He wants you to know about a will that he wrote right before he died, which he hid in a desk drawer in the back of the drawer in a hidden compartment. And nobody alive knew about that by normal means. We verify it. Now, the fact is, if that information is verifiable by normal means, then it's also graspable by clairvoyance, by ESP. So in principle, at least, any bit of information apparently coming from a deceased communicator, if it's verifiable, it can be explained in principle in terms of ESP among the living.
So, is there anything from the data then which can give corroboratory evidence, from your view, of survival?
I think it's really hard. And I had to write a long book to even try to work it out for myself. And in the end, although I decided that there's some evidence that I thought was stretching the super psi hypothesis more than it could stand, it wasn't a slam dunk. As far as we know, we can't impose any limits given the considerable extent of our ignorance about psychic functioning. We have no way of setting any limits in the abstract on how far we can go with it. In that case, we don't know just to what extent we can write a blank check about psychic functioning.
So let me see if I understand this. The first part of this argument is to have the data of people who know things they seemingly impossibly can't.
Right.
And you eliminate all the
usual
normal
suspects
and
and-
exotic
right.
normal explanations that would not be a survival information coming from the other side, as they say.
Right.
Then what you're left with is what people like to try to demonstrate, the real existence of the afterlife with the data.
Right.
But now you have this other category, super psi, or the ability of paranormal phenomena to explain it in a different way. And that, you're saying, is very difficult. So if you believe the data is real, then you're saying the explanation is one of those two things.
Yes, and one ironic part of this is that those who think that there's evidence for an afterlife can't rule out the super psi alternative because their view actually presupposes it in the following way. If my dead Uncle Harry is communicating with a medium, that's my direct mind-to-mind interaction. That's telepathy. Okay? If my dead Uncle Harry is commenting on my tie and says, I like the tie you're wearing today. If dead Uncle Harry knows what I'm wearing, that's clairvoyance on dead Uncle Harry's part. So the only difference between the ESP posited by the survivalists and posited by, say, the partisans of super psi is that as far as the survivalists are concerned, one participant in this interaction is deceased. That's the only difference.
So at the end of the day, what are your personal feelings about the existence of an afterlife? Do you think there's any data that supports it?
There's plenty of data that suggests it. And on my good days or bad days, depending on how you look at it, I'm inclined to think that the evidence is more compelling than not. But again, I don't think it's a slam dunk. I think it's a very difficult case to make. And I think most people either grossly underestimate or overestimate the evidence suggesting survival.
I hate to ask you this kind of question, but it's something that just occurs to me. That if this is real, if there really is survival, and if your dead Uncle Harry can communicate with you either directly or through a medium or however it is, why is all this stuff, and that's such a fundamental part of reality now, you're changing the whole worldview. Why is it more prevalent? Why isn't it happening more often? Why is it just in these isolated mediums and these very strange and awkward places? Doesn't make sense.
Well, I don't know that it doesn't make sense, but let's try to think sympathetically about it. If there is this realm, we don't know how, if there is this afterlife, we don't know how easy it is to make the connection with this life. I mean, many survivalists would say it's actually difficult to get a clear channel, an unimpeded channel of communication. For all we know, that's right. Okay, I think we have to give them that. That's certainly a possibility. We're in no position to rule that out a priori.
I agree, but I would think that if there is that afterlife, and if there is the possibility of this little channel someplace, then these are fundamental aspects of the way the world is constructed. Everything is constructed, and it just seems to be wholly ridiculous to have these little channels and difficulty emerging into these back corners of places in such rare situations.
I'm not sure how rare it is. I mean, it's during the heyday of spiritualism, lots of people came forward. I think a lot of it has to do with how easy it is to announce your mediumistic abilities in the culture in which you exist. There are parts of the world where this is very prevalent, and other parts of the world, mostly in industrialized cultures, where it's considered, if not on the level of being a child molester, at least something you'd want to come forward with.
Well, I agree, but there's good reason for that, because most of these have been proven to be charlatans or outright frauds or a crowd psychology or delusion or something, and so there are less people wanting to do it because everybody has been shown to be a fraud.
Well, let's not overstate that. There certainly have been plenty of people shown to be frauds. And that's just part of the economic law of mediumship. I mean, there's no way around that. As for why there seem to be relatively few people who can do this, there are analogs to that. I mean, manipulativeness is a pervasive part of behavioral reality, but the people who have a good nose for manipulativeness are relatively few. It took me many years to pick it out in my own family, for example.
So this is an ability of some people to sort of have this channeling?
Some people have a nose for it. Some people have a knack for it. We all have different perceptual antennae in every sort of ordinary situation. We're not all sensitive to the same range of things. Well, I suppose it extends only to normal phenomena.
You'd be comfortable with a world that had the greatest secret, the greatest structural novelty, the existence of an afterlife, finding its way to our information and to our knowledge through these odd and isolated sources. That's fine for your worldview.
I think it's something that we experience every day. I mean, all sorts of deep truths about the world seem to be understood only by a relatively small number of people.
So at the end of the day, with all that you know about the afterlife through talking to people who've maybe been there, are you looking forward to being there?
Some days. Some days I'd like to hasten it.
How about today?
Today's fine.